Thank you very much, Tim. Firstly, I'd like to thank Pippa and Sarah for having me and organizing the conference and making this possible. I would also like to acknowledge from the beginning the important work of John Younger and Esther Salvarella in particular, who have both made their work on Linear A available online as digital resources, both of which I've depended on for the research I will present today. So today I'll be speaking about the visual appearance of linear A signs on two different types of material, stone and clay. And I will present three case studies which illuminate the differences and similarities in sign formation on both materials. And my aim ultimately is to demonstrate that there is some degree of slippage across these media, and observing and analyzing these slippages can help us think about writing conventions on Minoan Crete. But first, a bit of background. I have Burton to thank for introducing the Aegean scripts to you all already. But so everyone is on the same page, we're in the Bronze Age Aegean on the island of Crete, and there were multiple scripts in use on the island during the Minoan period. And what we think is the earliest of these is known as the Arhana script, now familiar to you from Merton's talk. And this was followed, chronologically speaking, by the Cretan hieroglyphic script. And there was some overlap in use between this Cretan hieroglyphic script and the script I'm going to be talking about, Linear A, which was the predecessor of the more famous Linear B, which I assume everyone is familiar with. And in addition to these formalized scripts, there are also some more elusive examples of writing from the Minoan world, such as what appears on the Festos disc. Okay, so now I'd like to focus in on explaining Linear A a bit more. So Linear A is a script read left to right, generally speaking, but here I should note that there are some spiraliform inscriptions and even some which are boustrophodon, as we heard from Mia yesterday. The script comprises syllabograms, logograms, and ligatured and composite signs, so there's some very complex things going on. The script is undeciphered, but we do have a bit of familiarity with it and what signs mean, in addition to what they might, some of them even sound like, and this is through analogy with the successor script Linear B. And incidentally, today we will be looking at signs which all have a descendant in Linear B. So Linear A appears on a range of different materials, as you can see here on the slide. We have examples of clay tablets from the palaces, stone libation tables or stone vessels, ceramic vessels, so fired ceramic, metal pins, rings, and even plaster. So if you compare with the tablets of Linear B, you can see that Linear A has a much wider range of expression, if you like. So today I'll be focusing on clay tablets and stone vessels. And first I'll give you a brief overview of what they look like and how I think they may have been inscribed. And then I'll tell you some of the theoretical problems we have in trying to understand them. The clay tablets are small, typically rectangular documents which bear inscribed text. And they were inscribed when the clay was still wet, using a range of thin, pointed tools. These tablets were not deliberately fired, so the evidence we have is a happy accident. They were possibly reused after their initial function was served by wetting the surface of the clay and then smoothing it out and writing over it. So in other words, they were palimpsests, or we think they are. We have a lot of information of palimpsests from the Linear B tablets, but some perhaps less so from the Linear A, but we're assuming that they were reused. We have the examples that survive today because the clay was fired during the destructive episodes at the palaces where they were found in large numbers. So in other words, these documents were never intended to be permanent, and they reflect perhaps more ephemeral record-keeping system in place in the palaces. And the tablets are presumed to have an administrative function, both because of their spines, their fine spots, so in these palatial settlements, and their content. We can recognize numerals and signs for goods, so we assume that most of these tablets recorded inventories of the palaces. And we don't believe that these tablets recorded literature or personal correspondence. So this is quite different maybe from what we'd hope, I suppose. The stone vessels then were produced, we assume, to hold richly poured liquids or other offerings in quote unquote religious contexts. And I put these in air quotes because Minoan religion is a whole other topic that I won't be touching today. But let's just say they come from ritual contexts. These vessels were made from locally available stone, typically the relatively soft stalactite, but there are other examples including alabaster and marble, which are harder stones to carve. The vessels were carved then, and so too were the Linear A inscriptions which are present on some of the examples. And as I've argued in a recent paper, the craftspeople who carved the vessels employed their familiar stoneworking tools and motor habits, applied with slight adjustments in order to inscribe the text. So they're using skills and tools that are familiar to them from their craft in order to produce writing. The majority of inscribed stone vessels are found on peak sanctuaries, which are extra-urban ritual sites found on mountaintops. So these are quite different contexts from where we find the clay tablets. At this point, I should say that my title is slightly misleading in that it identifies two categories of people in Minoan society, stonemasons and scribes. Implicit in this is that one, these categories are identifiable from the evidence, and two, that these categories are distinct groups of people. In fact, we don't have sufficient evidence to identify professions as such in the Minoan world, and we ought to be careful not to assume too much about the people who made linear inscriptions, no matter on which medium. One significant issue hangs over discussion of these two corpora and these groups of people. This is a rather dubious binary between administrative writing and non-administrative. The clay tablets are generally thought to be the work of trained scribes, who recorded information to support the bureaucratic function of the Minoan palaces. And in fact, different hands have been identified on the tablets from sites with large corpora like Aya Triada. The palaces are considered economic centers as well as centers of political power, and the linear tablets are therefore viewed as part of the mechanism of running those centers. The non-administrative category refers to anything which falls outside this realm and can include ritual equipment such as the stone vessels. And this is a problematic category because it assumes a clear binary between these two realms, but also because the types of graphical artifacts included under this category are very different from each other. For example, we have beautiful inscribed jewelry and also inscribed pithoi, and they all fall under this category as well. The stone vessels and libation tables are thought of in the non-administrative category for two interdependent reasons. The first is their fine context, as I said, commonly on these peak sanctuaries, and the second is what we call the formulaic nature of many of the inscriptions, that is, certain sign sequences which are repeated on stone. And one of these sequences is referred to as the libation formula, which I drew actually over there on that piece of paper. And this is because it's a series of signs repeated on many stone vessels, which we assume were designed to hold or pour ritually poured liquids. The length of the linear A inscriptions on clay tablets is generally greater than on stone vessels, and there's much more variation in signs of the tablets, implying the necessity of a wider familiarity with the script. But this does not mean necessarily that the stone vessel makers were illiterate. I've previously argued that we need to widen our understanding of literacy in the Minoan world. And this is in response to a long-standing position that writing in the Minoan world, both the production of script and reading, was restricted to an elite few, i.e. a scribal or priestly class. And in that paper, I proposed some suggestions for how we should understand different groups of users of linear, different groups of communities of practice, if you like, specifically investigating the text on stone vessels. I argued that craftspeople who worked stone cannot necessarily be considered as illiterate or merely copying text prepared for them by those who inscribed clay tablets, as some models have proposed, given the range of sign formation visible on these vessels. And I should note here that while the libation formula is the most frequent stone vessel inscription, there are texts which are more varied and possibly also include personal names. So following this argument, I want to see how the script interacts across the materials of stone and clay. We know that a certain level of skill and familiarity with the script was necessary to create inscriptions. Firstly, the materials which linear A was inscribed, placed various constraints on sign formation. So if you take stone, for example, generally speaking, the ability to carve stone is a specialized skill, and rendering signs in such a medium adds a layer of complexity to the activity. Clay is a much more forgiving material than stone. Mistakes could be rubbed out and the material is much more pliant. But this does not mean that forming signs on clay tablets was necessarily a lesser skill. So before we move on to discussing the specific case studies, I would like to make some brief comments on chronology as it pertains to understanding sign formation. So dating the stone vessels is incredibly difficult because of the nature of their fine contexts. The more elaborate stone vessels typically come from what we would call richer peak sanctuaries, which have built structures, but many of these peak sanctuaries don't have built structures. In any case, there are few stratified deposits on peak sanctuaries, and although pottery has been recovered from all of these sites, this doesn't necessarily help much with providing secure dating for the stone vessels, and therefore it's difficult to date the inscriptions. So arguments about the development of sign formation based on chronology are a bit risky. And here I should also say that there have been some suggestions that inscriptions are added to stone vessels long after they were produced, perhaps as part of their deposition. So it's another stage in their life, so to speak. Receiving the inscription might be the final step in their use life. We have more secure dates on the destruction of the palaces and the clay tablet deposits, but I should say here only the terminus antiquem. But how this chronology relates to the stone vessels is unclear, and therefore trying to date one corpus ahead of the other is difficult, although the stone vessels are typically dated a little bit earlier. Okay, so to keep things simple, I have chosen 3 signs to investigate across stone and clay. These are AB80, the Mnemosyne or the cat face, AB08, the Ah sign, the double axe, and then AB13, Mnemosyne. The case studies I will present today are highly selected, okay? I should say this as a disclaimer, as there is a narrower repertoire of signs which appear on stone than on clay. So first, let's take a look at Ma, the cat face, and it's highlighted here in blue. So the first example here is an inscription on a miniature steatite libation table from Mount Yuktas. I don't know if any of you have been to the Heraclean Archaeological Museum, but this thing is so tiny, it could fit in the palm of your hand. So anyway, I'll try and give you a sense of scale as we go on, but this is really small. So you kind of have to think about the skill that was required to not only to make this object, but also to inscribe this beautiful text on it. The inscription carries part of the libation formula, and the inscription wraps around all 4 sides of the vessel. The Mnemosyne is visible on the far left, at the beginning of this particular line, so you can see better in the drawing. The face has ears, eyes, brows, a nose, and a mouth, and it's fully articulated and elaborated, which is even more impressive when you consider the small scale of the object. So, from Brisinas, we have just one corner of a libation table, which preserves a short part of what is presumably a longer inscription. And the Mnemosyne here on the corner is rendered by a sharp triangle for the face. So I'm over here on the left, here. 2 lines which meet in the middle to form the brow and inner sides of the ears. And the facial features are expressed by 2 deeply pierced eyes and a horizontal mouth. So at Festos, so this is a libation table. I'm moving over to tablets here on the right here. At Festos, we have 1 tablet bearing the Mnemosyne, which resembles these 2 fully articulated examples. So you can see the wide variation in sign formation across the site, though. So these are the other tablets from Festos that have these Mnemosynes, and they're quite different from each other. Okay. At Malya, the Mnemosyne appears only twice, and in both instances, the cat face is very well articulated. In the image on the left, a triangular face is observable, as well as 2 triangular ears and a smaller set of lines underneath the chin. There are 2 clear eyes and dots around the middle of the forehead. From Simi, we have this libation table with an inscription running along 3 of 4 sides around a central basin. So this is what I mean when I'm talking about a libation table. This central basin would have presumably be used to hold liquids, I suppose, maybe other things, organic material, maybe food offerings, that kind of thing. The Mnemosyne here is rather unusual. The face is composed of these kind of wavy lines, and the ears are 2 sets of V-shaped lines. But note, this also has no facial features, so we've kind of moved away from the previous examples that I showed you. This too, I should say, is a really tiny object, also the kind of thing you could hold in your hands. So this is a ladle from Toulouse, one of only two which have been discovered to bear linear A inscriptions. And ladles, again, were part of the set of Minoan ritual equipment, and they were used to collect and pour liquids. The linear A inscription on this ladle begins at the top left, but as you can see, it doesn't cover all of the available staves. There's a breakage there, but we know that the signs stop. The inscription is very worn, but there are traces of black ink, perhaps squid ink, which were used to enhance the text to show it up against the light-colored background. The Mnemosyne here is the anti-penultimate sign in this inscription, and the overall shape, the face of the shape of the face rather, is familiar from the first example I showed you from Yuktas. The face is rounded, coming to an angled point between the ears, and the ears are two empty triangles at the side of the head. I suppose it's possible that facial features were expressed in the past, as they are preserved on earlier drawings, for example, from gorilla, but it's clear that from this more recent, from this image, the surface of the vessel is quite abraded, so it's not certain. So this is a libation table from Connaissance, and the Mnemosyne appears as part of a variation of the libation formula there at the end. The shape of the face is like a flattened, sub-rounded oval. There are facial features expressed by a central dividing line for brow to nose and two small pierced eyes. And then two short little lines are placed at the corners of the flattened head to express ears. And both the ladle from Toulouse and this libation table from Connaissance bear inscriptions which are much more linear and abstract than the first two examples I discussed. Sorry, I sped through. Okay. Many of the Mnemosyne's examples from Aya Triada appear to conform to a certain style. The overall shape is a sub-rounded triangle, a central line divides the face, and each example has two eyes, and the ears are expressed by these little lines. But there is quite a bit of variation in other examples. About 5 of these express the sign with a more rounded face and looped ears. So I've highlighted those examples in blue on the right. And this is a type more commonly observed at Zakros. So I'm not saying that there's necessarily a connection here, but they're expressing them in very similar ways. Mnemosyne appears on a handful of clay tablets from Hanya, and here the sign is expressed through much more simple and abstract means. A triangle with 2 crossed lines in place of the ears. On only one example do we see a central dividing line on the face. Otherwise, there are no distinct features. And as an aside, on this tablet from Hanya, on the right here, there's also a possible erasure, so that little dotted circle underneath, so that this Mnemosyne might have replaced something else. Okay, so this is an example of the palimpsest sort of technique that I was discussing earlier. And this version of the Mnemosyne is perhaps, is no doubt the most abstract of all of them. Okay, now, let's move on to the A sign, the double axe. And the double axe is an important symbol from Minoan visual culture, okay, that has also entered the script. So you're going to see it's part of the Minoan ritual equipment as well. Where am I? Okay, so we're gonna have a look at the appearance of this sign on 3 of the stone vessels we've already seen. Okay, so let's go back to this one from Yuktas. This sign is expressed by deeply carved and curving blades supported by a central line. And this is perhaps the most elaborately expressed A sign on a stone vessel that we have. On the table from Simi, the sign appears much more simply. So the outer blades, and this again on the right, on the left over here. The outer blades are carved deeply, but they're mere vertical straight lines supported by one connecting horizontal line and a vertical post, so quite different from the first example. The sign as it appears on the ladle from Toulouse is quite similar, although the proportions of the blades to the central post are squatter than the example on the left. The A sign as it appears from Aya Triada again seems to follow loose kind of convention, resembling the examples on the stone vessels we just discussed. And from Palais Castro, there's a slightly different impression here. The whole inscription is very thin, the sign's shallowly carved and quite abstract. But the A sign here is a little bit more detailed than the ones we were just looking at. The central post has a bit of a wave to it, and the blades are expressed by two short, thin vertical lines, and there's this horizontal line that sits over the top. And we see this kind of construction quite often on clay tablets from different sites. And this type is expressed especially commonly on tablets from Zakros. The same is true from Hanya, that the Yasign follows a certain loose convention or distinct types. And some of the groups, especially at the top, the blades are a little bit more curved. But then in some other examples, they have this horizontal line down at the bottom that resembles the sign that we saw at Pelegastro. Okay. So this is the final case study that I have. Okay, so let's look at the Mnemosyne. So this appears on several stone vessels, and it's the final component of the standard version of the libation formula. So this is a miniature cup from Yuktos, okay? Here highlighted, and the sign is composed of different types of lines, both curved and linear. We have a similar example on a libation table from the Psykro cave, a very famous table, which you can see here was deliberately broken, perhaps as part of a deposition ritual. And there is a second vertical line on the rightmost edge of the sign, so another line has been added. The same sign from this Leda Latrulis is a significant departure from the first two examples. It's been rotated by 90 degrees, which we saw an example of yesterday, and it's adopted a much more abstract composition, only retaining essential components. And this is a characteristic of the rest of the inscription, but the rotation is notable. Approaching even further how the sign is attested on clay tablets, we have two final examples of stone vessels I wish to discuss. The first is a vessel from Prasa, which has a badly eroded surface. And relying on the drawings of the inscription, we can see that here on the far right, we have the Mnemosyne standing vertically as it does on the Lidl from Trulos. Note the double line on the rightmost edge of the sign. And this formation resembles very strongly examples of the men tablets found at Zakros. And a few examples here, though, you see that they've introduced this double loop element. Next, we have a different side of the same Pelegastro table that I introduced before. And like the other recent examples we've observed, the Mnemosyne is also vertical here. But unlike the others on the stone, this seems to represent this double loop element from the Zakros tablets. At Ayat Triada, there's only one single looped element, but the double hatching lines have been retained. So they're taking some elements seemingly, or rather not taking, but some of the signs resemble elements from other sites. Of course, there isn't complete uniformity of the sign formations. And the one that I've highlighted seems to be reminiscent of the Trulos ladle. Okay, so the evidence I've presented, I hope, demonstrates that similar types of signs occurred on both stone vessels and clay tablets. Of course, the manner in which they were rendered is not always the same, and there are some truly elaborate designs on the stone vessels, but the idea that the clay tablets only support abstracted signs should be challenged. Okay, we're seeing that they're borrowing a little bit more from those stone vessels. There is an assumption that clay tablets were inscribed with efficiency in mind, both in terms of saving on clay, which is a spatial consideration, and in terms of inscription speed. It's true that signs composed of fewer elements probably took less time to write, and there is evidence to support the notion that sign formation was dependent on the constraints of the medium. But this question of efficiency does not explain why some signs are rendered in similar ways on both clay and stone, for example, the Yasign and some examples of the Mnemosyne. This leads me to suggest that there was a slippage across these media, which should encourage us to think about how the communities practiced producing tablets in stone vessels interacted with one another. I hope that I have shown that there is considerable crossover of signs between these two media, and that this means perhaps a wider range of familiarity with the script in different circles. This does not mean that those who inscribed on stone vessels were not the same as those who inscribed on clay, although I would add to this that there are specific motor habits involved in the processing of stone and clay, which are distinctly different. But there's no need to argue that people in the Minoan past could not have mastered both skills. Nor does any of this mean that the transfer of knowledge of linear A signs had to go from clay tablets to stone vessel, or vice versa. We must keep open minds about the possibility of crossover knowledge in different directions when looking at these bodies of material. Thank you very much.